5 acts of violence, 5 states, 5 methods so calculated they rewrote laws and haunted courtrooms for decades. In 1797, a Charleston merchant choked on communion wine laced with foxglove while his congregation watched. In 1823, hunting hounds in Virginia tore through their master's throat on command. In 1839, a Kentucky manor burned with 13 family members locked inside from the outside. In 1851, Mississippi floodwaters rose around a plantation owner who could not swim because someone had taken every boat and cut every rope. In 1862, a North Carolina judge died in his courtroom from a blade hidden inside the Bible he kissed each morning. These were not crimes of passion. They were engineering, and the people who carried them out knew they would die for it. But they also knew their masters would die first. What follows is not speculation. It comes from trial transcripts, coroner reports, and the whispered memories of communities who understood that some justice lives outside the law. Charleston, South Carolina. Spring, 1797. The air inside St. Philip's Episcopal Church tasted of beeswax and salt wind pushing through open transom windows. Reverend Thomas Ashford stood at the chancel rail holding a silver chalice engraved with his family crest, 3 wheat sheaves over crossed swords. The communion wine inside had been poured that morning from a locked cabinet in the sacristy, a French vintage the Reverend reserved for Easter services and funerals of prominent families. 63 congregants knelt in pews of Charleston pine, heads bowed, waiting to receive the body and blood of Christ. Marcus Crenshaw, a rice merchant who owned 4 wharves and 18 human beings, was the first to approach the rail. He was 42 years old, broad-shouldered from years supervising dock labor, with a reputation for paying debts on time and attending vestry meetings without fail. His household enslaved a woman named Delilah, who managed his kitchen, and another named Ruth, who served at table during the dinner parties Crenshaw hosted for factors and ship captains. Ruth stood now in the gallery reserved for enslaved attendants, hands folded, face blank as plaster. Crenshaw took the chalice from Reverend Ashford's hands, tilted it, and drank. The wine moved down his throat. His Adam's apple bobbed once, twice. Then his hand flew to his neck, and the chalice clattered against the marble floor. Wine spread across white stone like a baptism in reverse. Crenshaw's face flushed the color of brick dust. His knees buckled. Reverend Ashford reached for him, but Crenshaw was already convulsing, his spine arching backward in a way spines should not bend. Foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. His eyes rolled white. The congregation gasped and surged forward, then stopped, unsure whether they were witnessing a medical crisis or something divine and terrible. Ruth watched from the gallery. Her expression did not change. Crenshaw died in 4 minutes. Dr. Edmund Priolo, who had been kneeling 3 pews back, examined the body and pronounced it a seizure, probably apoplexy, though the man had shown no prior symptoms. The wine in the chalice was collected and later tested by a chemist who found traces of foxglove, a plant whose leaves, when dried and steeped, could stop a heart in minutes while leaving only the faintest bitter taste. The discovery launched an investigation that would consume Charleston for 8 months. But the real question was never who. Ruth was arrested within 3 days after a kitchen girl reported seeing her near the sacristy on Saturday evening. The real question was how a woman with no freedom of movement, no access to church grounds after dark, and no reason to be near locked wine cabinets had managed to engineer a murder in front of 63 witnesses in a house of God. The answer would require understanding the invisible architecture of enslavement, the systems that made some deaths possible and others inevitable. Charleston in 1797 was a city built on rice, indigo, and human cargo. Its wealth moved through the hands of merchants like Crenshaw, who controlled the infrastructure, wharves, warehouses, factors' offices that connected plantation owners to international markets. The enslaved population outnumbered free white residents nearly 2-to-1. This demographic reality produced a legal structure designed to maintain control through terror, spectacle, and the careful management of information. South Carolina's Negro Act of 1740 outlined the mechanics. Enslaved people could not gather in groups larger than 7 without a white overseer present. They could not learn to read or write. They could not leave their owner's property without a signed pass. They could not testify in court against white people. Violations brought whipping, branding, or sale to the Sugar Islands, where life expectancy was measured in seasons, not years. But laws are only frameworks. They require enforcers, interpreters, witnesses willing to report, and courts willing to convict. Marcus Crenshaw had understood this. He sat on the City Watch Committee and donated generously to St. Philip's Building Fund. His slaves wore decent clothes, ate adequate rations, and were rarely beaten in public. To Charleston's planter class, Crenshaw represented enlightened management, the kind of paternalism that supposedly justified the entire system. Ruth had worked in Crenshaw's household for 11 years. She had been purchased at auction in 1786, separated from her mother and 2 sisters who were sold to a Sea Island cotton plantation. She was 14 years old then. By 1797, she was 25, literate despite the law. Having taught herself to read using newspapers Crenshaw left on his study desk. She had also learned chemistry from a book of household, remedies kept in the kitchen, a volume that included warnings about toxic plants, doses that healed, and doses that killed. The investigation revealed that Ruth had indeed been in the church on Saturday evening. The sacristy had been unlocked because the sexton, an elderly enslaved man named Jacob, had been cleaning brass candlesticks and left briefly to fetch polish from the supply closet. Ruth had entered through the side door, opened the wine cabinet using a key she had copied in wax weeks earlier, and added a precise amount of dried foxglove to a single bottle. She had then relocked the cabinet and departed. Jacob had seen her. He did not report it. Delilah, the cook, had noticed foxglove missing from the herb garden behind Crenshaw's house. She did not report it. A dock worker named Samuel had seen Ruth walking near the church after dark without a pass. He did not report it. This silence was not coincidence. It was infrastructure. Ruth had spent months building it, offering small favors, sharing food, providing cover for minor infractions, creating a network of complicity that ensured no one would speak until it was too late. She had also chosen her method carefully. Foxglove worked slowly enough that Crenshaw would not suspect the wine during the service, but quickly enough that he would die before anyone could intervene. The public setting was not accident, but strategy. Dying in church, in front of his peers, stripped Crenshaw of dignity and control in his final moments. The question that haunted Charleston's white population was simple and terrifying. If Ruth could do this, if a woman with no apparent motive and no obvious means could orchestrate a murder inside the sanctity of a church, who else was planning? What other quiet hands were mixing poisons, copying keys, waiting for the right moment? The answer came 3 months later when Ruth, in a pretrial deposition, explained exactly why Marcus Crenshaw had needed to die. Ruth's testimony was recorded by a clerk of the court on July 9, 1797. The document survives in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, filed under Negro Trials, Charleston District. Her words were translated through the legal language of the time, but the facts she presented were precise and verifiable. Marcus Crenshaw had raped Ruth repeatedly over a period of 9 years, beginning when she was 16. These assaults occurred in his study, his bedroom, and once in the carriage house during a dinner party, while guests ate oysters in the dining room above. Ruth became pregnant twice. The first pregnancy ended in miscarriage after Crenshaw struck her during an argument about burned bread. The second pregnancy went to term. She gave birth to a daughter in 1793. The child was light-skinned with Crenshaw's distinctive widow's peak. Crenshaw sold the baby when she was 6 months old. He sold her to a trader bound for New Orleans, specializing in domestic servants for French Creole households. He sold her for $170. He recorded the transaction in his ledger as disposal of surplus household property. Ruth never learned her daughter's name. She had called her Mary. Crenshaw forbade the use of that name after the sale. For 4 years, Ruth continued working in Crenshaw's household. She served his meals, pressed his shirts, poured his wine. She smiled when he entered rooms. She did not flinch when he touched her. She became, in the eyes of Charleston society, the model of enslaved domesticity, obedient, useful, invisible. But she was also reading, learning, planning. The foxglove had grown in the garden for years, planted by Delilah for use in small medicinal doses to treat heart palpitations. Ruth studied its properties, tested doses on kitchen mice, calculated the exact amount needed to kill a man of Crenshaw's size. She observed his habits, noted his routines, identified vulnerabilities. The communion wine was perfect because Crenshaw always drank first, a privilege of his position as senior warden of the parish. The key to the sacristy cabinet came from a wax impression Ruth made when Jacob left his key ring on the kitchen table. She pressed the key into a cake of beeswax, heated it to harden the mold, then used it to file a duplicate from a blank Jacob lost and had replaced without suspicion. The entire process took 7 weeks. Ruth's testimony also named 12 other enslaved people who knew about the plan. Some had helped actively, providing alibis, keeping watch, spreading misinformation. Others had simply chosen not to interfere, understanding that Ruth's grievance was specific, but her method was universal. If she could kill Crenshaw, others could kill their tormentors. The implication terrified Charleston's elite because it suggested that enslavement was not a stable system, but a powder keg, held stable only by the illusion of control. Ruth was hanged on September 14, 1797. Before her execution, she made a final statement. It was recorded verbatim by 3 witnesses and later published in the Charleston Courier. "I do not repent. I would do it again. He took my child. I took his life. That is justice." The statement was not defiance but accounting. Ruth understood she would die. She had known from the beginning, but she also knew that Crenshaw would die first, and that his death would be public, humiliating, and impossible to ignore. She had transformed her powerlessness into a weapon, and in doing so, she had created a template others would follow. 26 years later, in Virginia, another enslaved person would use a different method to settle a different debt. But the logic would be the same. Nottoway County, Virginia. October 1823. The kennel behind Thomas Whitmore's plantation house smelled of wet straw, raw meat, and the particular musk of animals bred for tracking. 7 coon hounds lived there, descendants of English hunting, stock crossed with local strains, trained to follow scent across swamp and thicket. Whitmore used them to hunt escaped slaves and, when sport allowed, raccoons and deer. The hounds answered to a man named Cyrus, 40 years old, who had worked as kennel master since childhood. Cyrus had been born on Whitmore's property. His mother had died in childbirth. His father had been sold when Cyrus was 8. Whitmore considered himself a progressive owner because he allowed Cyrus to sleep in a shed beside the kennel, rather than in the quarters with other field hands. This proximity, Whitmore believed, demonstrated trust. It demonstrated something else entirely. The hounds knew 2 commands. Track sent them after a scent trail. Hold made them surround a target without attacking. These commands kept runaway slaves alive long enough to be returned, punished, and resold. The dogs were valuable tools, worth more than most of the people they hunted. Whitmore insured them against accident and disease. On October 19, 1823, Whitmore took his usual morning walk through the kennels to inspect the dogs. He carried a riding crop and a leather satchel containing dried venison strips for rewarding good behavior. Cyrus stood near the feeding troughs, hands at his sides, waiting for instructions. The hounds circled Whitmore, tails wagging, noses pushing against his coat pockets. Whitmore noticed one dog limping. He called for Cyrus to bring the animal forward for examination. Cyrus whistled. The dog did not approach Whitmore. Instead, all 7 hounds stopped moving and formed a semicircle around their owner. Whitmore felt the shift before he understood it. The dogs had gone silent. Their tails hung low, their eyes fixed on his throat. Cyrus spoke a single word. Not track, not hold. A third command Whitmore had never heard. Take. The hounds hit Whitmore in a coordinated rush. The lead dog locked onto his throat. The others tore at his arms and legs, pulling him down, dragging him toward the kennel wall. Whitmore managed one scream before his windpipe collapsed. The attack lasted less than a minute. By the time Whitmore's overseer arrived, drawn by the noise, Cyrus was standing over the body, expressionless, while the hounds circled and whined. The overseer shot 2 dogs immediately and locked Cyrus in the grain shed. The Virginia authorities arrived within hours. They examined the scene, interviewed witnesses, and reached a conclusion that made perfect sense to them. The hounds had gone rabid and attacked spontaneously. Cyrus was guilty only of failure to control his animals. This explanation satisfied no one who actually knew dogs. The investigation that followed revealed a truth more disturbing than rabies. Cyrus had been training the hounds in secret for 16 months. He had added a third command to their vocabulary, practiced in the hours before dawn when no one else was awake. He had conditioned them to associate that command with aggression, with permission to kill, using captured possums and wild hogs as practice targets. The dogs had learned to work as a pack, to coordinate their attacks, to focus on specific body parts. Cyrus had studied them the way one studies a craft, observing which combinations of animals worked best together, which dogs led and which followed, how to time the strike for maximum efficiency. He had transformed hunting hounds into execution tools, but teaching the command was only half the equation. The harder part was ensuring the dogs would obey him over Whitmore when the moment came. This required undermining Whitmore's authority gradually, imperceptibly, over years. Cyrus had done this by feeding the dogs slightly smaller portions when Whitmore gave instructions, slightly larger portions when Cyrus gave them. By positioning himself between Whitmore and the animals during training sessions, by handling all medical care and grooming so the dogs associated comfort and relief with his presence, not the master's. The process was glacially slow and absolutely deliberate. Cyrus never struck the dogs in Whitmore's presence, never raised his voice, never showed frustration. He became, in the animals' minds, the true alpha. Whitmore was just another human, one whose commands could be overridden when the right word came. Why had Cyrus done this? The testimony at his trial, held in Nottoway County Courthouse on November 7, 1823, provided the answer. Whitmore had used the hounds to recapture Cyrus's younger brother, Samuel, after he fled the plantation in 1821. The dogs had tracked Samuel to a creek 7 miles north and surrounded him until Whitmore arrived. Samuel was returned to the plantation and whipped 40 lashes. He developed an infection that turned septic. He died 3 weeks later. He was 19 years old. Cyrus had watched his brother die slowly, day by day, in the infirmary cabin where enslaved people were left to recover or perish without medical intervention. After Samuel's death, Cyrus requested permission to bury him in the family plot near the quarters. Whitmore refused. Samuel's body was buried in an unmarked grave at the edge of the property, where the soil was poor and nothing grew. That was when Cyrus began training the third command. The court found Cyrus guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging, but the method of execution became controversial. Some argued that Cyrus should be hanged immediately to send a message about slave rebellions. Others argued that his death should be delayed so he could be questioned about whether other enslaved people were training animals for similar purposes. The debate paralyzed the court for 6 weeks. During that time, Cyrus was held in the Nottoway County Jail, a brick structure with barred windows and a packed earth floor. He was visited once by a minister who urged him to repent and accept God's mercy. Cyrus replied that he had already received the only mercy he needed, watching Thomas Whitmore die afraid. The minister documented this conversation in his diary, noting that Cyrus showed no remorse, no fear, and no recognition of sin. The diary survives in the Virginia Historical Society archives, filed under Ministerial Accounts, Nottoway District. Cyrus was hanged on January 3, 1824. His last words were instructions to the executioner about the proper way to secure a rope. He wanted it done efficiently. He did not want to strangle slowly. The hounds that survived were shot and buried. The kennel was dismantled. Whitmore's widow sold the plantation within a year and moved to Richmond. But the story of Cyrus and the hounds spread through Virginia's enslaved communities like wildfire. It proved that patience and technical knowledge could turn any tool into a weapon, that power was an illusion maintained only when the powerless agreed to maintain it. 16 years later, in Kentucky, another enslaved person would demonstrate that fire itself could be weaponized if one understood structure, timing, and wind. Woodford County, Kentucky. March 1839. The Bellamy estate sat on 600 acres of bluegrass pasture and tobacco fields, worked by 42 enslaved people and supervised by an overseer named Dutch Carver. The main house was a 2-story federal-style structure built in 1818 with 6 chimneys, a front portico supported by fluted columns, and a root cellar that doubled as storm shelter. Richard Bellamy, the owner, lived there with his wife, Margaret, their 5 children, and Margaret's elderly mother. They employed a house staff of 7, including a woman named Alice who managed the kitchen, and another named Grace who attended Margaret and the children. Alice had worked for the Bellamys since 1832. She was 34 years old, skilled in bread making and preserving, trusted with managing the household accounts for food purchases. This trust was not benevolence. Alice could not read or write, so Bellamy believed she could not steal or falsify records. He was correct about the falsification. He was wrong about the literacy. Alice had taught herself to read using the family Bible left open in the parlor and ledgers stored in Bellamy's study. She learned by candlelight, memorizing letters and words, practicing in the brief windows when the house was empty. By 1838, she could read well enough to understand contracts, deeds, and architectural drawings. She paid particular attention to the architectural drawings. The Bellamy house had been designed by a local builder named Thomas March, who had studied engineering in Philadelphia before returning to Kentucky. March's plans, filed with the county assessor, showed the house's load-bearing walls, beam placements, and the complex network of chimneys that vented smoke from 6 fireplaces. Alice found these plans in Bellamy's study while dusting in January of 1839. She studied them for 3 weeks, memorizing the structure, understanding which walls mattered and which were merely decorative. On March 11, 1839, Bellamy hosted a dinner party for 12 neighboring plantation owners and their wives. The gathering was meant to celebrate a recent tobacco auction that had brought good prices and to discuss shared concerns about abolition agitation filtering down from Ohio. The guests arrived at 6 in the evening. By 9, they had consumed significant quantities of bourbon and were debating whether Kentucky should adopt harsher penalties for teaching slaves to read. Alice served them roasted duck, cornbread, and sweet potato pie. Grace poured wine and cleared plates. The guests did not notice when Alice excused herself to tend a minor kitchen issue. They did not notice when she disappeared for 17 minutes. Alice moved through the house with the purpose of someone executing a plan refined over months. She visited each of the 6 fireplaces, adding specific materials to the coals. Fat wood scraps soaked in lard, bundles of straw wrapped tight, accelerants that would catch slowly and burn hot. She wedged these materials behind andirons and beneath grates, positioning them to ignite simultaneously once the fire reached a certain temperature. She also locked 3 doors from the outside: the front parlor door, the upstairs hallway door leading to the guest bedrooms, the root cellar door, which could only be opened from above. The fires began at 10:43 p.m. They spread faster than anyone anticipated because Alice had understood something the architect had not. The chimneys, designed to vent smoke upward, created draft channels that fed fresh air to the flames. The house became a kiln. Bellamy and his guests realized the danger within minutes, but the locked doors created confusion and panic. They tried windows, but the iron bars installed to prevent slave theft also prevented escape. They tried the cellar stairs, but the door would not budge. They tried the second-floor balcony, but the fall was 15 feet onto flagstone. 13 people died in the Bellamy house that night. Only 4 escaped. 2 guests who broke through a first-floor window, Bellamy's youngest son who was pulled out by a field hand, and Grace, who fled through a servant's entrance Alice had deliberately left unlocked. Alice herself walked away from the fire and did not return. She joined a group of enslaved people being moved along the Underground Railroad, passed from conductor to conductor, hidden in attics and root cellars and false-bottomed wagons. She reached Canada in June of 1839 and lived there under the name Ruth Freeman for 46 years. She died in 1885, leaving behind a written testimony about the Bellamy fire, stored in the archives of the Buxton Settlement Museum in North Buxton, Ontario. Her testimony was discovered in 1967 by a graduate student researching fugitive slave narratives. It described the fire in technical detail, the type of wood used, the placement of accelerants, the reason certain doors were locked and others left open. It also explained her motive in a single paragraph that contained no bitterness, only accounting. Richard Bellamy had fathered 3 children with enslaved women on his property. Alice had been one of those women. She had given birth to a son in 1834. Bellamy sold him in 1836 to a cotton trader bound for Mississippi. The child was 2 years old. Alice never saw him again. Bellamy's justification for the sale, recorded in his personal correspondence with the trader, was that the boy's presence created domestic complications and unsettled the peace of the household. Margaret Bellamy had demanded the child's removal after seeing him playing in the yard with her own children. She could not tolerate the visible evidence of her husband's infidelity, even though infidelity was too gentle a word for what Bellamy had done. Alice's testimony, written decades after the fire, described the moment she decided to kill him. It was not rage, it was mathematics. She wrote, "He took my son for his wife's peace. I took his family for mine." The Woodford County investigation into the fire concluded that it was accidental, caused by a faulty chimney. This conclusion was convenient because it avoided uncomfortable questions about whether enslaved people could plan and execute complex acts of sabotage. The alternative, that Alice had engineered a mass killing using architectural knowledge and materials found in any household, was too destabilizing to acknowledge. But the enslaved community in Kentucky knew the truth. Grace, the woman who escaped, told others what she had seen. Alice's disappearance immediately after the fire suggested guilt, and the specific pattern of locked doors, the fires starting simultaneously in all 6 chimneys, indicated planning that went far beyond accident. The story spread, not through newspapers or official channels, but through the invisible networks that connected plantations, churches, and markets where enslaved people gathered. The story taught a lesson. Any structure could burn if you understood its weaknesses. Any system could be destroyed from within if you studied its architecture. Kentucky authorities responded by requiring inspections of enslaved quarters, checking for architectural drawings, fire-starting materials, or evidence of literacy. They found nothing. The knowledge had already dispersed, carried in memory rather than paper, shared in whispers rather than documents. But the fire had achieved something beyond immediate revenge. It had demonstrated scale. Ruth in Charleston had killed 1 man. Cyrus in Virginia had killed 1 man. Alice had killed 13. Each escalation expanded the calculus of risk for slaveholders, made them understand that their deaths could arrive, through their food, their animals, or their own homes, turned into traps. 12 years later, in Mississippi, another enslaved person would prove that nature itself could be conscripted into service, that the landscape could become an executioner if you understood water, wind, and the limits of human endurance. Warren County, Mississippi, April 1851. The Yazoo River reached flood stage twice a year, once in spring when snowmelt from northern tributaries pushed water south, once in late summer when hurricanes dumped rain across the delta. The spring flood was predictable, manageable, part of the rhythm that shaped plantation agriculture in the region. Owners built levees, elevated their main houses, and accepted minor property damage as the cost of living on fertile bottomland. Samuel Pritchard owned 900 acres along the Yazoo's eastern bank. His plantation produced cotton primarily, with some corn and livestock for local sale. He enslaved 63 people, including a man named Moses who worked as a river tender, responsible for maintaining the levee, monitoring water levels, and predicting flood timing. Moses was 52 years old, born in Georgia, sold to Mississippi in 1834. He had worked on 5 different plantations before landing at Pritchard's in 1846. Moses understood rivers. He understood how current flowed, where debris collected, how sandbars shifted, and which sections of levee were strong versus merely adequate. This knowledge made him valuable. Pritchard trusted Moses to handle river management without supervision, a trust that proved catastrophic. The flood of April 1851 was larger than normal, but not unprecedented. The Yazoo rose 6 feet above its banks, pushing water across fields and into low-lying areas. Pritchard ordered enslaved workers to reinforce the levee nearest the main house and move livestock to higher ground. The work proceeded normally for 3 days. Then, on April 9th, at 2:30 in the morning, a section of levee collapsed. The breach occurred 200 yards upstream from the main house, in a section Moses had personally inspected the day before and declared sound. Water poured through the gap, widening it, carving a channel that grew from 10 feet to 40 feet in under an hour. The current swept away 3 outbuildings, flooded the cotton gin, and surrounded the main house, which sat on elevated ground but was now an island in churning brown water. Pritchard, his wife, and their 3 children woke to water lapping at their doorstep. They ran upstairs to the 2nd floor and shouted for help. They could see the quarters, also on elevated ground, less than 300 yards away. They could see people moving there, lanterns bobbing, voices calling. But no boats came. Pritchard did not know that Moses had removed every boat from the property 2 days earlier, claiming they needed repair. The boats were hidden in a creek 4 miles north, tied to cypress stumps, safe from the flood. Pritchard also did not know that every rope longer than 10 feet had been cut into useless segments, the pieces scattered in the barn, unusable for rescue lines. The water kept rising. By dawn, it had reached the 2nd floor windows. By mid-morning, it had entered the house. Pritchard and his family retreated to the attic. They broke through the roof and climbed onto the peak, clinging to the chimney while water swirled 15 feet below. They screamed for help. They waved shirts as signals. They prayed. Moses watched from the quarters. So did 62 other enslaved people, all of them standing on dry ground, all of them capable of building rafts or forming human chains or attempting some rescue. They did nothing. Pritchard drowned at 3:17 p.m. when exhaustion loosened his grip and the current pulled him away from the roof. His wife drowned trying to save him. Their 3 children, ages 4, 7, and 9, drowned within the next hour as the water continued rising and the roof timbers began to crack. When the flood receded 2 days later, investigators found the bodies downstream, tangled in debris. They also found the levee breach and determined it had been deliberately weakened, stones removed from the base, earth loosened, the structure sabotaged to fail under pressure. Moses admitted everything. He explained that he had studied the levee for months, identified its weakest section, and methodically removed material each night in small amounts that would not be noticed but would accumulate into structural failure. He had timed the sabotage to coincide with peak flood stage, ensuring maximum water volume and current strength. He had removed boats and ropes to eliminate rescue options. He had waited decades for this opportunity. When asked why, Moses provided the same answer others had given before him: accounting. Samuel Pritchard had purchased Moses's wife and daughter in 1848. He worked them in the fields despite the daughter being only 9 years old. The girl died of heat stroke in 1849. The wife died of pneumonia in 1850, weakened by overwork and grief. Pritchard had shown no remorse. He had replaced them with new purchases and continued operating as before. Moses was hanged on June 2, 1851. Before his execution, he made a statement that was recorded by the sheriff and later entered into county records. He said, "Water does not distinguish between guilty and innocent. Neither did Mr. Pritchard." The Pritchard plantation was sold at auction 6 months later. No one local wanted it. The property had a reputation. Buyers avoided land where enslaved people had successfully orchestrated deaths because it suggested that other enslaved people on adjacent properties might have similar plans. The stigma was economic as well as superstitious. A plantation where laborers might kill was a bad investment. But the deeper lesson from Mississippi was strategic. Moses had used patience measured not in months, but in years. He had cultivated trust, gained autonomy, and waited until natural disaster provided cover for sabotage. He had demonstrated that violence did not require weapons or poison or fire. It required understanding systems and knowing which failure points would cascade into catastrophe. This knowledge was terrifying because it could not be legislated against. No law could prevent enslaved people from learning how rivers worked or how structures failed. No amount of surveillance could monitor every levee inspection or every nocturnal adjustment of stone and earth. 11 years later, in North Carolina, the final case in this sequence would prove that even institutions meant to embody justice could be subverted, that the very symbols of legal authority could be turned into instruments of execution. New Hanover County, North Carolina, February 1862. The courthouse in Wilmington was a Greek revival structure built in 1844, designed to project permanence and authority through its white columns, marble stairs, and heavy oak doors. Judge Lawrence Pemberton had presided over the Superior Court for 14 years, hearing cases that ranged from property disputes to murder trials. He was known for thoroughness, for strict interpretation of statute, and for requiring that witnesses swear their oaths on a specific Bible, a leather-bound King James edition he kept in his chambers and carried to the bench each morning. The Bible had been a gift from Pemberton's father, also a judge, who had inscribed the first page with a directive: "May this book guide your judgments and keep your conscience clear." Pemberton treated the Bible as both a sacred object and a professional tool. He believed that the act of swearing on it transformed testimony from mere speech into binding truth. An enslaved man named Thomas worked in the courthouse as a porter and custodian. His responsibilities included cleaning the courtrooms, maintaining the wood stoves, and preparing the judges' chambers each morning. Thomas was 41 years old, born in North Carolina, owned by the county and leased to the courthouse for a monthly fee. This arrangement made him property of no single individual, but rather the judicial system itself, a status that carried symbolic weight. Thomas had worked in the courthouse for 9 years. He was quiet, efficient, and trusted to handle documents, keys, and the logistics of trial preparation. Judges and clerks treated him as invisible furniture, speaking freely in his presence because they assumed he could not understand legal concepts or remember complex information. This assumption was false. Thomas had taught himself to read using court documents left on desks and tables. He had studied case law, property deeds, and trial transcripts. By 1862, he understood North Carolina's legal code better than many attorneys who practiced in the courthouse. He understood, for instance, that enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. But he also understood that this rule created blind spots in the justice system, areas where evidence could be planted or manipulated without detection. On February 6, 1862, Thomas arrived at the courthouse before dawn to prepare for a property trial scheduled for 9 a.m. He unlocked Judge Pemberton's chambers, lit the wood stove, arranged documents on the desk, and placed the Bible on the witness stand in the courtroom. He performed these tasks as he had hundreds of times before, with one addition. He had attached a thin blade to the spine of the Bible. The blade was 2 inches long, sharpened to a razor edge, positioned so it would cut deeply into the palm of anyone who gripped the book with enough force. Thomas had wrapped the blade's base in layers of leather dye and cork shavings mixed with extract of monkshood, a plant whose toxins entered the bloodstream through open wounds and caused paralysis, cardiac arrest, and death within hours. The poison was crucial because Thomas knew he could not kill Pemberton through blade trauma alone. A small cut would be noticed and treated, but a small cut combined with a fast-acting toxin would appear to be a medical crisis rather than murder. The Bible would be the weapon, but the poison would be the executioner. Judge Pemberton arrived at 8:45 a.m. He entered his chambers, reviewed the day's cases, and at precisely 8:58 walked to the courtroom carrying the Bible. The trial began at 9. By 9:37, the first witness was called to the stand. The witness, a white landowner disputing boundary lines, placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. He felt a sharp pain in his palm, but dismissed it as a splinter or rough binding. He testified for 14 minutes, answered questions from both attorneys, and stepped down without incident. The second witness, called at 10:15 a.m., was Judge Pemberton himself. North Carolina law required judges to occasionally testify in cases where they had direct knowledge of property histories or legal precedents. Pemberton placed his right hand on the Bible, gripping it firmly as was his habit, and felt the blade slice into his palm. He jerked his hand back, blood welling from a 2-inch cut. He examined the Bible and found the blade now exposed. He called for a recess, wrapped his hand in a handkerchief, and demanded to know who had handled the Bible that morning. Thomas was questioned immediately. He denied knowledge of the blade, suggested it must have been placed by someone else, and offered to help search for additional tampering. His calm demeanor convinced the sheriff that he was innocent. The investigation shifted to court employees and visitors who might have had access to the judge's chambers. But by noon, Pemberton was feeling unwell. By 2 p.m., he was experiencing numbness in his extremities. By 4 p.m., his heart rate had become irregular. Dr. Franklin Morrison, the county physician, examined him and found symptoms consistent with poisoning. He tested the blade and confirmed traces of monkshood. Judge Pemberton died at 6:43 p.m. His last words, recorded by Dr. Morrison, were a question. "Who did this to me?" The answer came 3 days later when Thomas attempted to leave Wilmington. Thomas had planned his escape carefully. He knew that suspicion would eventually focus on him as the person responsible for preparing the courtroom. He had arranged for a contact in the Underground Railroad network to meet him at the river docks on the night of February 9th. A boat would take him upriver to a safe house, from there to another conductor, eventually to Philadelphia. But Thomas had underestimated 2 things. First, the speed with which white authorities would mobilize after a judge's murder. Second, the willingness of some enslaved people to cooperate with investigations when their own safety was at risk. A kitchen worker at the courthouse named Jacob had seen Thomas handling the Bible on the morning of the 6th. Jacob had not thought it suspicious at the time, but under questioning by the sheriff, he mentioned it. This was enough to justify arresting Thomas and searching his quarters. The search revealed a notebook where Thomas had sketched the Bible's design, noting measurements and the optimal placement for a concealed blade. It also revealed pressed samples of monkshood leaves and a vial of extracted toxin. The evidence was conclusive. Thomas was held in the county jail, a brick structure behind the courthouse, while authorities decided how to proceed. The case presented legal complications because Thomas was county property, and his execution would represent a financial loss. Some officials argued he should be sold out of state to recoup costs. Others argued that public execution was necessary to deter similar acts. The debate lasted 6 weeks. During that time, Thomas was interrogated repeatedly. He was asked whether others had helped him, whether his plan was part of a broader conspiracy, whether enslaved people in other counties were preparing similar attacks on white officials. Thomas provided no information. He confirmed that he had acted alone, that he had built the weapon over a period of 3 months, and that he had chosen Pemberton specifically. When asked why, Thomas gave an answer that silenced the courtroom. Judge Pemberton had presided over a case in 1857 involving the sale of Thomas's wife and children to settle a debt. Pemberton had ruled in favor of the creditor, ordering the family separated and sold to different buyers. Thomas's wife went to a plantation in Georgia. His 2 children, ages 5 and 7, were sold to a textile mill in South Carolina. Thomas had petitioned the court to reconsider, arguing that the debt was based on fraudulent claims. Pemberton had dismissed the petition without hearing. Thomas explained all of this calmly, methodically, as if presenting a legal brief. He noted that Pemberton had sworn an oath to uphold justice but had instead upheld a system that treated human beings as collateral. He noted that the Bible Pemberton kissed each morning contained passages condemning such practices, yet Pemberton had ignored them in favor of property law. He noted that the judge's death was not murder but settlement of accounts, payment for a debt Pemberton had incurred by destroying Thomas's family. The courtroom was silent, not because anyone agreed with Thomas, but because his logic was uncomfortably coherent. He had used the tools of the legal system, evidence, testimony, and accounting to justify an act that the legal system itself would punish with death. The contradiction was too blatant to ignore. Thomas was hanged on April 14, 1862. His execution was public, attended by over 300 people, both white and black. Before the sentence was carried out, Thomas was offered an opportunity to speak. He declined. He had already said everything necessary. The Bible used in Judge Pemberton's courtroom was burned after the trial. A new Bible was purchased and kept under lock in the clerk's office, brought to the witness stand only when needed, then immediately secured. The practice of judges carrying personal Bibles to court was discontinued in New Hanover County, but the damage to the system's credibility was permanent. Thomas had proven that even the most sacred symbols of justice could be weaponized, that trust was a vulnerability, and that the law's authority rested on the assumption that those who served it would not turn its tools against it. This assumption had always been fragile. Now it was shattered. 5 murders, 5 methods, 5 states. But the pattern was singular. Each act of violence demonstrated that enslaved people could study, plan, and execute killings using the infrastructure of enslavement itself. Ruth used communion wine. Cyrus used hunting hounds. Alice used architecture. Moses used a river. Thomas used a Bible. None of these methods required access to weapons or external assistance. All of them exploited trust, routine, and the slaveholders' assumption that enslaved people lacked the capacity for long-term strategic thinking. The assumption was not just wrong, it was lethally wrong. Southern newspapers in the 1850s and 60s documented growing anxiety about what they called servant violence. Articles warned plantation owners to inspect their food, supervise their animals, and monitor their household staff. Some recommended hiring white overseers to sleep in the main house. Others advocated selling off enslaved people who showed signs of literacy or technical knowledge. But these responses treated the problem as individual rather than systemic. They assumed that removing a specific person would eliminate the threat when, in fact, the threat was structural. As long as enslavement existed, as long as people were held in bondage without legal recourse or hope of freedom, the incentive to kill remained. And the methods would proliferate because knowledge spread through networks authorities could not detect or disrupt. The 5 murders documented here were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern of resistance that rarely appeared in official records, because white authorities had every reason to suppress such information. Admitting that enslaved people could and did kill their owners required acknowledging that enslavement was not a stable system, but a state of permanent, low-intensity warfare. What would you do if the law offered you no protection, no voice, no remedy for the theft of your children, your labor, your life? Would you accept it as inevitable? Or would you study the systems that oppressed you, identify their weaknesses, and engineer their collapse from within? These 5 people chose engineering. They chose patience over passion, strategy over spontaneity, and they chose to accept their own deaths as the price of justice because they understood that some debts could only be settled in blood. Their stories terrified white Southerners because they revealed the precariousness of power. Every master who drank wine, every hunter who kept dogs, every owner who built a house or lived near water or swore oaths on Bibles, now had to wonder whether his own property was studying him, waiting for the right moment to act. Paranoia became rational policy, but paranoia could not stop what was already in motion. By 1862, when Thomas killed Judge Pemberton, the Civil War was underway, and the entire system of enslavement was collapsing under external pressure. The 5 murders chronicled here were precursors to that collapse, early tremors indicating that the ground beneath slavery was unstable and that those who stood on it could not assume it would hold. The architects of these 5 deaths did not live to see emancipation. They died on scaffolds, condemned by courts that treated their actions as criminal rather than revolutionary. But their methods survived, passed through oral tradition, whispered in quarters, remembered in communities that understood what official history would not acknowledge. That resistance was not futile, that justice could be engineered, and that power belonged to whoever understood systems well enough to break them. White authorities in all 5 states investigated whether the murders were coordinated, whether a network of enslaved people was sharing information and planning synchronized attacks. They found no evidence of conspiracy because there was none. Ruth, Cyrus, Alice, Moses, and Thomas never met, never corresponded, never coordinated. They acted independently, motivated by personal grievances rather than collective ideology. But independence did not mean isolation. Each of them operated within communities that chose not to intervene, not to report, not to stop what was happening. This communal silence was its own form of coordination, not through explicit planning, but through shared understanding of what justice required when law offered none. The silence protected more than just the killers. It protected the knowledge they generated. After Ruth poisoned Crenshaw, other enslaved people in Charleston learned that foxglove could be weaponized, and wine was a viable delivery method. After Cyrus used hounds, enslaved people across Virginia began studying animal behavior more carefully. After Alice burned the Bellamy house, architectural drawings became objects of covert interest wherever they could be found. This knowledge dispersed through networks that resembled mycelium more than organization, decentralized, resilient, capable of transmitting information without central nodes or vulnerable leadership. White authorities could arrest individuals, but they could not arrest the idea that systems could be sabotaged, that technical expertise was transferable, and that patience measured in years could outlast any amount of surveillance. The 5 murders were proof-of-concept demonstrations. They proved that chemistry, animal training, engineering, hydrology, and material science could all be weaponized using resources available within the plantations and households where enslaved people lived. They proved that literacy was not necessary for strategic thinking, though it helped. They proved that long-term planning was possible even under conditions of extreme oppression. Most importantly, they proved that slaveholders were vulnerable in ways they had not anticipated. Their wealth, built on controlling other people's labor and bodies, depended on those people accepting their subordination as permanent. But acceptance was performance, and performance could be maintained until the moment it wasn't. The 5 killers understood this. They performed obedience for years, even decades, while accumulating knowledge and waiting for opportunities. They smiled when expected to smile. They worked when expected to work. They demonstrated loyalty until the moment they demonstrated otherwise, and by then it was too late for their owners to defend themselves. This is what terrified Southern elites more than the murders themselves: the realization that trust was a liability. Every enslaved person who appeared loyal might be performing. Every interaction might be reconnaissance. Every moment of dependence on enslaved labor was a moment of vulnerability. The system required trust to function, but the 5 murders proved that trust could be weaponized as efficiently as any poison or fire. No conspiracy was necessary because the logic of resistance was self-evident. If you were enslaved, if your children could be sold, if your body could be brutalized without legal consequence, if you had no recourse through courts or law, then violence became a rational tool. The 5 killers had simply applied reason to their circumstances and reached conclusions that slaveholders found unthinkable but could not refute. The absence of conspiracy made the situation more dangerous, not less. A conspiracy could be infiltrated, disrupted, decapitated. But individual actors, motivated by personal grievance and armed with technical knowledge, could emerge anywhere, at any time, using methods that varied by opportunity and expertise. There was no way to predict or prevent such acts short of abolishing the system that created the incentive. Southern states did not abolish enslavement in response to the 5 murders. Instead, they passed laws restricting enslaved people's access to information, tools, and materials. They criminalized literacy more aggressively. They increased punishments for even minor infractions, trying to suppress resistance through escalating brutality. These measures failed because they addressed symptoms rather than causes. The 5 killers had already demonstrated that enslavement was unsustainable, that it rested on assumptions about human passivity that were empirically false, and that its continuation required constant, exhausting vigilance that would eventually collapse under its own weight. The collapse came in April of 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the Confederacy dissolved. The system that Ruth, Cyrus, Alice, Moses, and Thomas had attacked with poison, hounds, fire, water, and blades finally fell to armies and political pressure. But their individual acts had foreshadowed that fall, had proven that enslavement could not endure, and had demonstrated that those who held power through violence could lose it the same way. The 5 murders left more than corpses and trauma. They left blueprints. After 1865, when the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, formerly enslaved people carried memories of what Ruth, Cyrus, Alice, Moses, and Thomas had done. These memories were not celebrated openly. Violent resistance remained dangerous to discuss, but they circulated through families and communities as cautionary tales and, occasionally, as inspiration. During Reconstruction, when white supremacist groups used terror to suppress black political participation, some of the methods pioneered by the five killers resurfaced in new contexts. Poison appeared in unexpected places. Fires destroyed the homes of Klan leaders. Accidents befell prominent racists with suspicious timing and precision. These incidents were rarely prosecuted because evidence was scarce and witnesses were silent. The pattern repeated during Jim Crow. In the 1920s and 30s, when lynchings surged across the South, some black communities responded not with passive endurance, but with calculated retaliation. A Mississippi newspaper from 1924 reported that a man who had participated in a lynching drowned in a river under unclear circumstances. His body was found downstream, tangled in debris, with no witnesses to explain how he had ended up in water that should have been easily avoidable. The details echoed Moses's method from 1851: understanding water, removing options for rescue, waiting for nature to complete what sabotage had initiated. These echoes were rarely documented in official records. White authorities had no incentive to investigate too deeply, and black communities had learned that silence protected both the living and the memory of the dead. But the knowledge that resistance was possible, that power could be disrupted through technical expertise and patience, persisted across generations. By the mid-20th century, the civil rights movement adopted different tactics: nonviolent protest, legal challenges, mass mobilization. These approaches were strategic responses to changed circumstances, not moral repudiations of what earlier resistors had done. The five killers had operated under enslavement, a system that offered no legal recourse and punished even peaceful dissent with death. Their methods reflected those constraints. When constraints changed, methods changed. But the underlying logic remained constant. Systems built on oppression are inherently unstable, and those who understand systems can find ways to destabilize them. The five murders also entered folklore. In some versions of the stories, the killers became almost mythical figures. Ruth, the poisoner who used church wine. Cyrus, the houndmaster who trained loyalty to betray. Alice, the architect of fire. Moses, the river tender who drowned his master. Thomas, the clerk who weaponized scripture. These folklore versions often omitted the specific grievances, the dead children and stolen families, that had motivated the killings. They focused instead on the cleverness of the methods, the audacity of the acts, the satisfaction of seeing power inverted even briefly. This transformation into folklore was both necessary and incomplete. Necessary because communities needed stories of resistance to sustain morale during ongoing oppression. Incomplete because folklore simplified complex moral terrain, turning individual tragedies into collective triumphs without fully grappling with the costs. The costs were real. Ruth, Cyrus, Alice, Moses, and Thomas all died for what they did. Their deaths were public, designed to terrorize others into submission. The executions were spectacles meant to reinforce that resistance would be punished absolutely. But spectacle can backfire. Public executions of the five killers also publicized their methods, demonstrated that enslaved people could kill their owners, and proved that even total surveillance could not prevent such acts. The intended deterrent effect was undermined by the unintended message: power is fragile. This fragility became part of the folklore as well. Stories passed down through generations included not just the killings themselves, but the panic they created. The investigations that found no conspiracies, the laws passed in futile attempts to prevent future incidents. The folklore celebrated not just the killer's ingenuity, but the system's inability to defend itself once its victims decided to attack. Much of what happened remains unknown. The 5 cases documented here survived because they resulted in trials, which generated records, testimonies, depositions, death certificates, newspaper articles, court filings. These materials were preserved, sometimes accidentally, in archives that later generations could access. But how many other murders went unrecorded? How many slaveholders died under circumstances officially attributed to accident, illness, or natural causes, but were actually the results of calculated acts by enslaved people who never got caught? The historical record is biased toward cases where perpetrators were identified and prosecuted. Silent successes left no trace. Some evidence suggests the 5 cases were representative, not exceptional. Estate records from the antebellum South show that slaveholder mortality rates were higher than demographic models predicted, even accounting for disease, violence, and other documented causes. Some historians attribute this discrepancy to stress, poor medical care, or environmental factors. But another explanation is that some deaths were disguised homicides, executed skillfully enough that investigations never identified them as such. This hypothesis is impossible to prove. Dead bodies from the 18th and 19th centuries cannot be exhumed and re-examined with modern forensic techniques. Written records are incomplete and often destroyed. Oral traditions preserve some information, but also introduce distortions over time. What remains is suggestive rather than conclusive. A pattern of slaveholder deaths, a body of knowledge about poisons, animals, fire, and sabotage that circulated through enslaved communities, and a legal and social structure that made such knowledge both necessary and dangerous to possess. The 5 killers were outliers only in the sense that they were caught. How many others succeeded and were never identified? The answer is unrecoverable, buried in the same silence that protected those who acted and those who knew but did not speak. This silence was strategic, not accidental. It protected the living. It preserved methods for future use. It denied white authorities the satisfaction of complete knowledge. And it created a historical record defined as much by absence as presence, by gaps that hint at truths never fully documented. Modern historians call this the hidden transcript, the unrecorded resistance that existed beneath and alongside the official narratives of slavery and Reconstruction. The 5 murders documented here are rare glimpses into that hidden transcript, moments when events became public enough to leave traces in archives. But the hidden transcript is vast. It includes not just murders, but sabotage, work slowdowns, feigned ignorance, theft, arson, and countless small acts of defiance that accumulated into systemic inefficiency. Enslavement was never as total as slaveholders believed, because those enslaved always found ways to resist, even when resistance meant risking death. The 5 killers chose the most visible, most dangerous form of resistance. They killed not because they believed it would end enslavement, but because specific individuals had harmed them irreparably and deserved to die. Their acts were personal, not political, though their effects were both. The political effect was to demonstrate that the system was vulnerable. The personal effect was to settle debts that law would never address. Both effects mattered. Both left marks on the historical record and the collective memory of communities that survived enslavement and its aftermath. The sites where the 5 murders occurred no longer bear markers. St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Charleston, was rebuilt after an 1835 fire and still holds services, but nothing in its sanctuary acknowledges Ruth or Marcus Crenshaw or the communion wine that became a delivery system for justice. The Nottoway County Kennel where Cyrus trained hounds was dismantled in 1824, its location now a field overgrown with kudzu. The Bellamy estate in Kentucky burned completely, and the land was subdivided and sold, its history forgotten by everyone except descendants of those who worked there. The levee Moses sabotaged in Mississippi has been rebuilt multiple times, most recently after flooding in 2011, with no mention of why the original structure failed. The Wilmington courthouse where Judge Pemberton died was replaced by a modern building in 1926, and the old Bible was lost or discarded decades ago. But the stories persist. In Charleston, some black families still pass down the story of a woman who poisoned her master during communion. In Virginia, elderly residents of Nottoway County remember hearing about hounds that turned on their owner. In Kentucky, local historians debate whether the Bellamy fire was accidental or deliberate. In Mississippi, the flood of 1851 is remembered as the worst in county history, though few know about Moses's role in the deaths. In North Carolina, court employees sometimes mention the judge who was killed by his own Bible, though details vary with each retelling. These stories survive because they matter. They document resistance that official histories often erase or minimize. They prove that enslavement was contested at every level, from the smallest acts of defiance to calculated killings that required years of planning. They demonstrate that those held in bondage were not passive victims, but strategic actors who used every resource available to fight back, even when fighting back meant dying. The 5 killers were not heroes in any simple sense. They committed murders. They killed not just their immediate oppressors, but, in some cases, family members who were guilty only of proximity. Their actions caused suffering that rippled through communities and justified harsher laws that punished people who had done nothing wrong. But they were also not villains. They were people whose children had been stolen, whose bodies had been brutalized, whose lives had been reduced to instruments for others' profit. They acted within a system that offered them no legal recourse, no protection, no hope of justice through official channels. They made choices that seemed rational within those constraints, even if those choices were morally complex and deeply costly. Their legacy is equally complex. They demonstrated both the possibility and the price of resistance. They proved that power could be disrupted, but not that disruption guaranteed freedom. They showed that technical knowledge could be weaponized, but not that weaponizing knowledge would end oppression. They were individuals who acted alone, but whose actions reverberated through communities and across generations. And they remain, even now, subjects of whispered conversations in places where history is contested and memory is long. The 5 most disturbing slave murders that shocked America did not shock because they were gratuitously violent. They shocked because they were precise, patient, and impossible to prevent without dismantling the system that made them necessary. That system eventually fell, but not because of these 5 killings. It fell because of armies, politics, and the accumulated weight of resistance at every level. But these 5 murders were part of that weight. They added pressure to a structure already cracking. They proved that enslavement required constant vigilance, and vigilance eventually exhausts even the powerful. They demonstrated that those held in bondage were not defeated until they chose to be, and some never chose. Some still tell the story of Ruth and the communion wine, Cyrus and the hounds, Alice and the fire, Moses and the river, Thomas and the Bible speaking in low voices when the history books fall silent. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.